Is Fergie really finally clearing off?
President Trump weighed in on the whole Andrew scandal overnight.
A swift number of charities that came forward very quickly in a short amount of time to distance themselves from Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York.
Ever-evolving soap opera, that is, of course, what's happening over at Royal Lodge.
Several charities have cut ties with Sarah Ferguson. This is because of an email she reportedly wrote to Jeffrey Epstein, calling him a supreme friend.
So damaging about this email is that it actually highlights the cynicism in which she's approached this.
Charities linked to Sarah Ferguson moved with startling speed on Tuesday to publicly distance themselves from the former Duchess of York. The swiftness of their retreat speaks volumes about what insiders have known for decades. Sarah Ferguson was never the fairy tale duchess the palace hoped she would become. She entered royal life accompanied by laughter, infectious charm, and an undeniable sense of chaos. She departed it in scandal, public disgrace, and effective exile from the institution she once represented. Now, as the former Duchess navigates yet another controversial chapter without the man she persistently called her best friend, old stories have violently resurfaced, stories that paint an uncomfortable picture of betrayal, crushing loneliness, and critical errors in judgment that would permanently alter her trajectory. Before the internationally humiliating toe-sucking photographs, before the effective exile from royal circles, long before her so-called redemption arc began. There was another affair, one that allegedly commenced while she was still pregnant with Princess Eugenie. This is the story of how a woman who never quite managed to fit into royal constraints became one of the most scandalous and controversial figures in modern British royal history. When Sarah Ferguson married Prince Andrew on July 23, 1986, many royal observers saw the union less as a genuine love story and more as calculated royal damage control. Charles and Diana's marriage was already visibly faltering, cracking under intense public scrutiny, and the palace desperately needed a distraction, something young, energetic, lively, and camera-friendly. Fergie, as she became universally known, appeared to fit that bill perfectly. She was loud, enthusiastic, refreshingly informal, and strikingly unroyal in her approach to public duties. The British press initially liked her quite a bit. The Queen's traditional courtiers absolutely did not. Almost immediately upon her entry into royal life, tensions began forming beneath the surface. Her jokes were considered too casual and inappropriate, her personal style too brash and attention-seeking, her appetite for media coverage too insatiable for an institution that fundamentally demanded restraint, discretion, and dignified silence above all else. Still, she threw herself energetically into royal responsibilities, presenting herself as the cheerful, accessible, modern Duchess. She and Andrew welcomed Princess Beatrice in 1988, and 2 years later, Princess Eugenie arrived. But behind the smiling official photographs and cheerful public appearances, the marriage was already experiencing serious fractures. Andrew's demanding naval duties meant he was deployed and absent for most of each year. Fergie later admitted publicly she spent many months utterly alone, reportedly forbidden by Prince Philip to accompany her husband to his various military postings. Her own quote reveals the depth of her disillusionment. "I married the man, but what I got was the palace." By her own candid admission, she saw Andrew for merely 40 days annually. And during those long, isolated absences, the loneliness began taking a severe psychological toll. The palace expected her to behave precisely like a dutiful officer's wife, quiet, obedient, invisible when appropriate. But Sarah Ferguson had never embodied any of those qualities naturally. In 1989, Fergie traveled to the United States to attend the Houston Grand Opera's British Opera Festival. It was there, far from Windsor's watchful eyes, that she encountered Steve Wyatt, a wealthy, charming Texan businessman who possessed confidence, warmth, and an interest in the Duchess that extended far beyond polite diplomatic small talk. He wasn't intimidated by her royal status or position. He was, as one sympathetic biographer carefully phrased it, attentive, genuinely affectionate, and exactly what she desperately needed at that vulnerable moment. They connected instantly and powerfully, and according to multiple credible sources close to the situation, their connection turned unmistakably romantic, even as she carried her second child, Princess Eugenie. For a woman who felt increasingly abandoned by her absent husband, this wasn't merely temptation or a moment of weakness. It represented escape from an increasingly unbearable situation. By the early 1990s, persistent rumors about Sarah's relationship with Steve Wyatt were actively circulating throughout Fleet Street's newspaper offices. He was spotted attending royal-adjacent social events. He'd flown to London under discreet travel arrangements designed to avoid detection. But everything exploded catastrophically into public view in January 1992, when photographs of Wyatt with a toddler-aged Princess Beatrice surfaced prominently in major newspapers. The unspoken message was absolutely unmistakable to royal watchers. Sarah Ferguson had introduced her young daughter to her lover. For the palace establishment, that crossed every conceivable line of acceptable behavior. Biographer David Lee later wrote explicitly that Steve Wyatt was genuinely the love of her life, and that this affair represented the real underlying reason her marriage to Andrew collapsed so completely. When asked about Steve Wyatt years later during interviews, friends of Fergie claimed she never truly recovered emotionally from that relationship's end. 2 months after those damning photographs made international headlines, Sarah and Andrew formally announced their separation. It should have concluded there, handled quietly, civilly, contained within appropriate boundaries. But the summer of 1992 brought an even more catastrophic disaster that would define her public image permanently. While holidaying at a private villa in the south of France, the Duchess was photographed topless beside another American man, her financial advisor, John Bryan, as he kissed and sucked her toes beside the pool. The explicit images were printed across newspapers worldwide within hours. The royal family was reportedly mortified beyond measure. The Queen was said to be personally devastated by the public humiliation. Prince Philip wrote to Sarah directly, stating bluntly, "You have done more to bring shame on this family than could ever have been imagined." The reputational damage was absolutely irreversible. Sarah Ferguson had transformed overnight from troubled royal to national punchline and international embarrassment. By 1993, her reputation was damaged beyond any realistic hope of repair. Formal negotiations for legal separation were actively underway, and by 1996, the marriage was officially dissolved. She received a relatively modest financial settlement compared to her royal peers, just over £3 million, a fraction of what Princess Diana would later receive in her own divorce settlement. Yet despite everything, despite the scandals and public humiliation, Sarah and Andrew maintained an unusually close and comfortable friendship. They continued sharing Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, successfully co-parented their daughters, and even took family holidays together regularly. Sarah frequently described them publicly as the happiest divorced couple in the world. It was an unconventional arrangement that apparently suited them both quite well, until very recently, when circumstances changed dramatically. Decades later, the same couple, once relentlessly mocked by the press for being too casual, too chaotic, and too scandal-ridden, are once again positioned at the center of serious controversy. Following Andrew's catastrophic public association with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein and his subsequent forced removal from all royal duties and official titles, the pair's long coexistence at Royal Lodge has reportedly come to a definitive end. They're said to be going their separate ways at last, after nearly 2 decades living under the same roof. For Sarah, this development marks the end of a genuinely strange royal chapter, one that began in glamour and optimism, spiraled dramatically into scandal and humiliation, and concluded in quiet survival and mutual accommodation. Sarah Ferguson has always represented a fundamental contradiction. At times, she's portrayed as the comic relief of the monarchy, clumsy, overly emotional, impossible to manage or control. At others, she serves as the cautionary tale, The woman who definitively proved that charisma without discipline and discretion can absolutely destroy you within rigid institutional structures. She courted media attention when she absolutely shouldn't have. She trusted people she demonstrably shouldn't have. And in a world where every misstep inevitably becomes a headline, she provided her critics with endless material for decades. But what made her public downfall so compelling to observers is that she never pretended otherwise. She was messy, chaotic, and brutally unroyal in temperament and behavior. She once said memorably that she married into a cage of gold, and when the doors finally opened through divorce, she didn't know how to behave as a free person. Every subsequent attempt at independence, whether questionable business deals, book publishing contracts, or controversial friendships, seemed to conclude in fresh scandal. She was mocked relentlessly by tabloids, rejected firmly by palace courtiers, and ridiculed on late-night television programs internationally. Yet somehow, remarkably, she endured and persisted. Decades later, Sarah Ferguson remains something genuinely rare, a royal exile who flatly refuses to disappear from public consciousness. She still calls herself a loyal supporter of the monarchy. She still speaks warmly of the late Queen and fiercely protective of her daughters. But the uncomfortable truth is that her place in royal history has been permanently sealed as a cautionary reminder of what happens when raw emotion collides with rigid institution, and when personal weakness transforms into international public spectacle. Her affair with Steve Wyatt didn't merely destroy her marriage. It cemented her reputation permanently, and it perfectly demonstrated character traits that would resurface repeatedly: an apparent ability to deceive, a troubling lack of accountability, and a pattern of doing whatever she pleased simply because she could, regardless of consequences. To the palace establishment, she'll always be remembered as the Duchess who embarrassed them irreparably. To the public, she represents the woman who couldn't stop talking and couldn't stop falling apart publicly. Her name continues surfacing in connection with questionable business ventures, dubious international associates, and reckless financial decisions. From her stint as brand ambassador for a failed cryptocurrency firm accused of misleading investors to endless tabloid reports about persistent money troubles and desperate publicity stunts, it's abundantly clear that controversy has remained her most constant companion. Insiders claim the former Duchess has quietly begun planning a potential exit from the United Kingdom, perhaps to escape the intensifying scrutiny now surrounding both her and Prince Andrew. Speculation about new business deals abroad and luxury properties overseas has only fueled speculation that she's preparing to reinvent herself once again, this time far from Windsor's eternally watchful eyes. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.